Hello and welcome back. I'm Nathan with a History of Current Events, a podcast where I summarize the important history and key players behind today's headlines. I've been away from the mic for over a year now, as I've been off in Japan teaching English. And while I wanted to come back and do an episode on Japanese history, since its faltering currency and population problem have been making the news recently, something else came up which could not have escaped your notice. The attack by Hamas on Israel. On October 7, 2023, the Palestinian militant terrorist group Hamas launched a coordinated surprise attack on Israel from their stronghold in the Gaza Strip, massacring over 1,400 Israelis and taking some 230 hostages back with them. Israel has been the target of countless terrorist attacks throughout its history, but none have come close in magnitude to this heinous attack. In response, Israel has launched a number of retaliatory strikes on Gaza, which have killed around 8,000 Palestinians so far and displaced about 1 million more. The Israelis are poised to begin a ground offensive into the Strip, which is one of the most densely populated areas in the world. While the situation is already a humanitarian catastrophe, things are likely to get even worse in the near future. Yep, if you were looking for a lighthearted reintroduction to the podcast, you're fresh out of luck. But I promise if you stick around, you'll learn a thing or two about this quagmire of a conflict between the Israelis and their Arab neighbors. This is probably the most divisive topic I've ever covered, so I'm going to begin by saying I'm not here to prop up one side or the other. I'm very much an outsider looking in, and the research I've done for this episode is honestly pretty damning for both sides. I'm not going for the sensationalism or nationalist fervor, just the facts. Given the complexity of the issue and the span of history involved, though, I'm breaking this one into 2 parts. So let's tackle the history here. Israel Part 1. The Question of Palestine. Whatever you wish to call it, Canaan, Palestine, or Israel, is a small strip of land about the size of New Jersey that runs along the Mediterranean coast of the Levant in the Middle East. It is the site of many holy places for 3 of the world's major religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, especially in the ancient city of Jerusalem. Palestine has been controlled by a plethora of kingdoms and empires throughout its long history. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Caliphates, and the Turks, just to name a few, but has generally been the home of the various Canaanite peoples and their descendants. The history of this area stretches to the very beginnings of civilization, but for the sake of brevity, I'll begin with the Jewish-Roman Wars. The Jews of Israel, indigenous Canaanites in origin, had been expelled from and relocated to Palestine more than once, but in general they had called that land home for what historians might label a very long time. Anyway, Rome came in, like Rome always did, and conquered the region. The Jews decided they didn't much care for wearing togas and rose up in revolt against the Roman occupiers, who responded by pounding their rebellious province into the dust, destroying much of Israel and scattering its population to the wind. While a few Jewish families remained in their homeland, many of the survivors fled abroad, mostly across Europe, in what became known as the diaspora. For context, this was a little under 2,000 years ago, around the time when Judaism and Christianity split. Speaking of which, under the Byzantine Empire, many of those who remained in Palestine, the non-Jewish descendants of the Canaanites, converted to Christianity, which didn't always bode well for the Jewish communities that remained. But their little spat didn't end up mattering much, because there was a new religion on the block: Islam. The Muslim Arabian tribes conquered Palestine around 640 AD, and Palestine went through a phase of Arabization in which the Canaanites mixed with the Arabs, adopting Arab customs, and the area quickly became majority Muslim. There remained a small Christian and Jewish minority in Palestine, and the 3 Abrahamic religions generally got along just fine, except for a few periods of religious persecution against the Christians and the Jews. Then, of course, the Crusades happened, which saw the armies of Western Christendom duking it out with the armies of Islam. Reacting to atrocities committed by the Crusaders, the few Jews remaining in the Holy Land threw their lot in with the Muslims to expel them. The Muslim establishment of the time tended to be a bit more friendly to the Jews than the Christians were. Later in the 1500s, the Ottoman Turks conquered Palestine, though not much changed for the average Jamal. The region was operated feudally, with most of the primarily Palestinian Arab population being rural agricultural workers governed by wealthy families, and things continued in this manner for centuries. Meanwhile, the Jewish diaspora continued to face discrimination and persecution across Europe, and while many migrated around the continent or to America, some started to look to their ancient homeland for salvation. In the late 19th century, Zionism, the idea of the Jews returning to and reclaiming their ancestral homeland, took hold in diaspora communities across Europe. Spurred on by the pogroms in the Russian Empire, which saw widespread attacks on and displacement of Jewish communities, the Jewish intelligentsia began to imagine a Jewish state in Palestine, and they formed a Zionist Congress in 1897 to shape this dream of a national home for the Jewish folk into a reality. The first major obstacle to the Zionist dream was the fact that the Jewish people were spread across the world and only represented a small percentage of the current population of Palestine. In the year 1900, there were about 24,000 Jews in Palestine, just 4% of the total population of 590,000, with the rest being primarily Muslim Arabs or part of the Christian minority that outnumbered the Jews almost 3-1. So, the first order of business was to encourage the Jews of Europe to migrate and boost that percentage. These first waves of immigrants were known as aliyahs, Hebrew for rising. But at first, the number of Jews who actually undertook the journey were relatively insignificant, boosting the Jewish percentage of the population to just over 5%. And things in Palestine continued much as they had. As with many of today's issues, the real conflict between the Arabs and the Jews in Palestine began as a result of the events of World War I. The Ottoman Empire, having maintained control of Palestine for 4 centuries, had weakened considerably and was derided as the sick man of Europe. In an attempt to re-establish their position among the great empires of the age, they threw their lot in with the Central Powers in their war against the Allies. This proved to be, to put it mildly, a bit of a gaffe, as they now found themselves at war with the British Empire. Now, the British were pretty busy fighting Germany over in Flanders, but they had the novel idea of spurring the various Arab tribes, who were not fans of a bunch of Ottoman Turks telling them what to do, into a revolt against their overlords in Istanbul. In return for their help, starting in 1916, the British promised the Arab leaders that they would be able to govern themselves in the countries that would be carved out of the ruin of the Ottoman Empire, including in the region of Palestine. This sounded like a good trade to them, and the Arab revolt played a pivotal role in the defeat of the Turks and the dissolution of their empire. Meanwhile, the Zionist movement had grown in influence, and many in the West began to sympathize with their desire for a state of their own. In fact, this idea was so popular that in 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour sent a declaration to Zionist leaders promising that the British government would help establish a, quote, national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, following the inevitable defeat of the Ottomans. You see how this was problematic, right? The British government had just promised the Jews and the Arabs the same parcel of land for them to govern, and both would expect a delivery on that promise. Whoops. Well, the war came to an end, but contrary to both promises, neither the Jews nor the Arabs were given the territory of Palestine outright. You see, in the early days of the war, the British and the French had decided that if they managed to defeat the Turks, they would divvy up the Ottoman territories amongst themselves. The newly created League of Nations went along with this plan and broke the former Ottoman territories into mandates to be governed by the victorious French and British until the peoples of those lands could set up their own governments and establish self-rule. This happened rather quickly in British Transjordan and Iraq and French Syria and Lebanon, but the British would maintain suzerainty over Palestine for decades. This was largely because of the sticky situation the British had gotten themselves into. The Palestinians, whose ancestors had been living in Palestine for millennia, but had never really seen a time out from under the thumb of one empire or the other, were looking forward to some good old home rule. However, despite being promised by the British and the League of Nations, this self-determination had not materialized in Palestine, despite the fact that it had in all of the other mandates. What's more, all of a sudden, they looked over and saw a huge wave of European Jews buying land and settling in Palestine. You see, the Balfour Declaration had been incorporated into the fabric of the British mandate system, and under their rule, the region experienced a massive aliyah, which saw the Jewish population grow from 84,000 in 1922 to 554,000 by 1945. This wave of hundreds of thousands of immigrants was driven by the horrors occurring in Europe, where Hitler and the Nazis had taken power in Germany in 1933 and began persecuting the Jews in every land they conquered. Those who could fled, and those who didn't would find themselves the victims of the Holocaust in the coming years. This completely upended the demographic makeup of Palestine. At the end of the First World War, around 10% of the Palestinian population was Jewish, but by the end of the Second, in just over 20 years' time, that percentage had risen to 31%. And as Europe was liberated and the survivors of the Holocaust were freed, more Jews were immigrating than ever. The Palestinians, having discovered the British intent to uphold the Balfour Declaration, saw this aliyah as a threat to Arab home rule. And so clashes began between the Palestinians, who felt like their home was being stolen, the Jews, who sought to establish a significant foothold in the region, and the British, who struggled to keep them all in check. A full-scale uprising ensued from 1936 to 1939, which saw Arab attacks against British forces and Jewish districts, resulting in hundreds of deaths, while British troops and Jewish paramilitary groups, like the Haganah and the Irgun, retaliated against Palestinian communities, killing thousands. The British occupiers saw this as too much to handle themselves, and in 1937 they proposed a partition of Palestine into two states, one Arab, the other Jewish. But the Jewish leadership saw this as merely a foothold from which to take more of the territory, and the Palestinians rejected the partition outright. Both felt entitled to the entirety of the land, and both saw violence as the only means by which they could accomplish this. So, the riots and the attacks and the indiscriminate acts of terror against each other continued. The outbreak of World War II led to an uneasy truce between the two factions, as both declared their support for the Allies in the fight against fascism, with the Jewish population forming their own Jewish Brigade, which saw combat in Italy. The Second World War was the most destructive conflict in human history, and the Holocaust committed by the fascists against the Jews of Europe led the survivors into a mass exodus, and still more Jews flooded into Palestine. In the wake of the atrocities of the Holocaust, foreign support for the creation of a Jewish state was at an all-time high. The British, weakened by the war, coming under attack from the impatient Jewish paramilitaries, and weary of trying to keep the two peoples of Palestine in check, decided in 1947 to withdraw from the mandate, handing the issue over to the United Nations. The UN decided it would be best to partition Palestine into two roughly equally sized Jewish and Arab states, with the Holy City of Jerusalem governed by the UN, since it was sacred to both parties. But the opinions of the Jews and the Palestinians had not changed in the 10 years since the British first proposed that little fixeroo. As the British began to pull out, the Palestinians went on a general strike and committed acts of sabotage. The Jews positioned themselves to take control of the major cities and areas of Palestine, even the ones outside their UN-drawn borders, aiming to take the entirety of the region by force. Arab militias committed acts of terror against Jewish communities. The Haganah and Irgun began to attack Palestinian civilians unchecked, and these acts of violence spiraled into an ever-widening conflict. All the while, the militaries of their Arab neighbors, Lebanon, Syria, Transjordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Egypt, all mobilized to come to the aid of the Palestinians, with the goal of driving the Jews out and establishing a purely Arab state. The board was set. And then, on the 14th of May, 1948, the British mandate officially ended. Zionist leader David Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the State of Israel, and the Middle East was plunged into a state of war. Well, that's it for Part 1. Please join me soon for Episode 2, where we'll explore the near century of conflict that has led up to the present day. As usual, this has been an extremely condensed history, so if you have any questions or something you want to add, please leave a comment or feel free to send me an email at historyofcurrentevents@gmail.com. And thanks for listening.